Welcome to today's Power Hour. We're happy that you joined us today. My name's Becca Blake, and I'm the Communications Director here at the Chamber. We have a Power Hour session scheduled every month for the remainder of 2025, and they're always at 10 a.m. on Tuesday. On the first Tuesday of every month. And this program is something that you can participate in from the comfort of your office, which is very, very nice. We're also recording each session, and we'll be adding the recording to the online resource center that is now in your member information center. And that's where you can, that's what you see when you log into your Chamber's website. So if you miss a Power Hour, you can always go back and watch it later. We're not going to take the time to have everyone introduce themselves today because we want to leave as much time as possible for the content and to take questions. So I would actually love it, though, if you would leave your name and your business or organization in the chat so that we know who's here today. And then we're also going to be emailing the PowerPoint slides to all who attend today's presentation. If you have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A section or in the chat, and we're going to keep an eye on those throughout and have our presenter answer as many as possible. But today's presentation is called Conflict Resolution in the Workplace. It's presented by a staff member from IRONWOOD Business Consulting. And before I introduce him, I just want to tell you about that partnership that we have with IRONWOOD and the benefits you can take advantage of as a member of the Chamber. First, IRONWOOD Business Consulting is a member of the Blue Springs Chamber, and they specialize in helping employers navigate the complexities of regulatory compliance. They can help in areas of human resource services, Department of Transportation services, and crisis management services, to name a few. And all of our members have direct access to that service with both either a phone call or email support to their compliance experts. We at the Chamber have actually used them a couple of times, and they responded very quickly. They set up an appointment where we were able to walk through the issues. They gave us feedback for the things that we hadn't thought of yet and gave us some suggestions, which really just gave us a lot more confidence to deal with the issues appropriately. So you can find more on our website. If you go to bluesprings.chamber.com, we have a members tab and a resource center there. I did put a link for it in the chat, so you guys can pull that up if you'd like to. And to get started with IRONWOOD, all you have to do is fill out a simple one-page service agreement, send it back to them or to us here at the Chamber. And you could do that now if you wanted to, just to save that step in the future. And that way, when you need something in the future, all you have to do is email the appropriate person based on your question. So again, this is provided to our members at no additional cost, and it's included with your membership. So it's a great perk that we are thrilled to be able to offer you guys. So let me introduce today's speaker. This session is presented by Mitch Guimond. Mitch is located in Texas, and he's a human resources coordinator at IRONWOOD with over 8 years of HR experience in the private sector. Prior to joining IRONWOOD, Mitch worked for 2 large international corporations within the security and tech industry. Mitch has experience within multiple facets of human resources, specializing in employee relations, investigations, compliance, ADA, FMLA, and training and development. He has over 3 years of direct employee relations and investigative experience within both union and non-union environments. He has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, and he's certified as a licensed private investigator in the state of Texas. So, Mitch, take it away.
Thanks so much, Becca. So yeah, we're going to be covering conflict resolution in the workplace. Before we get too much further into it, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to throw those in the chat. I've got another member of our team that's going to be joining in and moderating kind of on the back end. So Kyle's going to be helping out. So you can throw the question in there. If Kyle's able to get to it, she'll jump on it. And then if we have time at the end, we can always go through it and talk through those questions more in depth. But don't feel like you need to sit on your questions and wait till the end. You can throw them in the chat whenever they come to mind. That way you're not forgetting about them or anything like that. Another little bit of housekeeping. We just have a quick disclaimer here. Again, like Becca mentioned, this is going to be recorded. So this is just notifying you that, hey, it's going to be recorded. The information may be used for marketing purposes, further training material, or for potential distribution. And then one last disclaimer before we dive into it. So this webinar is going to be based on kind of general guidance and information about current laws and best practices. However, as we've seen throughout the last year, laws can change, whether that's on the federal, state, or local level. So it's always a good idea to take the time to familiarize yourself and double check those regulations as you're encountering situations, just to make sure you're operating off the most current information possible. While this is a snapshot of the current situation, it's just that, a snapshot, and things can change. I do also want to preface this with the fact that I'm not an attorney, so this isn't legal advice. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right into it. So, what is workplace conflict? Well, at its core, it's any clash or disagreement between individuals or groups over differences in needs, values, interests, or goals that disrupt productivity, teamwork, or well-being. So there's a couple kind of key forms that we'll be breaking down a little bit further on the next slide. But they can be task related, they could be relationship related, they could be process related. Ultimately, it's any sort of a disagreement or conflict between two individuals or two groups that could potentially disrupt or interfere with the way things are going within the organization. So typically they're going to fall into one of these 5 categories, and they do have some overlap. So task conflict, that's typically when there's a disagreement on what needs to get done. So for example, if you have two team members that disagree on a marketing strategy to implement for a new product launch, boom, they're trying to figure out what the plan of attack is going to be, what needs to actually get done. If you compare that with a process conflict, which is where there's a disagreement with how it gets done. So an employee is frustrated because tasks are reassigned without notice, causing workflow confusion. So they're very similar, but there is kind of a difference there. One's focused on the process of getting there. One's focused on the actual task itself that needs to get accomplished. Relationship conflict tends to be pretty common. That's those situations where, whether that's prior experience, previous interactions, personality, things like that, there's a disagreement between two coworkers or two groups based on that relationship itself. So a lot of the times that'll manifest in passive-aggressive emails, non-collaborative behavior. They may not want to work with that employee that they have that relationship conflict with. Status conflict. So that's when there's a discrepancy or a conflict stemming from the actual structure itself. So you could have a junior employee that feels like they're being dismissed, or you get that senior employee that doesn't want to take in any feedback from somebody that they believe is lower than them. Organizational conflict, that's typically going to be where you see a lot more of those group conflicts. So if you have two different departments that are tackling different aspects of a project that's cross-functional, there can be conflict in there where, you know, this group wants to accomplish their objective, this group's waiting on this other group, and issues tend to arise from those things. A couple of misconceptions to get out of the way, though. Not all conflict is bad. A lot of the times you'll talk to people and they're conflict avoidant. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to ever see conflict. They want everything to be just a field of flowers. But that's not always the best solution. Sometimes conflict can be good. If you have a disagreement on a process, you can sit there and talk through it. And at the end of it, you may find a way to make things more efficient. Another common misconception is that if you leave conflict alone, it'll sort itself out. And in my experience, that's rarely the case. A lot of the times when I've seen kind of the beginnings of a relationship conflict, if it's not intervened with early, it tends to spiral out. If I look at the past investigations that I've done into situations of possible workplace violence, a lot of the times it started out as kind of an initial relationship conflict that then festered, kept growing. One employee was kind of picking at the other one. And then it hits that breaking point where there's an eruption and then it turns into something more serious. Not all conflict needs to be unpleasant. You can have a civil discussion about, hey, I disagree with how we're approaching this. I had a conversation like that with one of my directors where we were looking at how we were looking at one of our metrics. We went into that, we had a disagreement on it, but we were able to talk through it, reach common ground, and everything worked out fine. It was a civil discussion. Conflict and disagreements are not the same. So disagreements, they tend to be more minor, whereas if it's actual conflict, that's when you start to see that escalation where there's more of a active process to it. There could be employees that are refusing to engage with the other person. They may see escalations. You may see more complaints, things like that. But conflict does not always need to destroy those workplace relationships. Again, like I touched on, conflict can be beneficial. It just needs to be harnessed and focused in the right ways. And steps need to be taken to kind of put in those guardrails to make sure it doesn't spiral off the tracks. So what are the costs of conflict? Well, the biggest one, productivity drain. I mean, sure, any managers on this call have experienced it where you've got two employees, they're in conflict. Now you need to spend time managing that conflict or managing those disputes instead of focusing on your actual objectives and making sure things are moving forward. And that's not counting the disruption among the employees themselves. I mean, I had one where two employees, they had a personality conflict, and I spent probably 2 hours talking through and mitigating a situation where one of them had not said hi to the other in the morning and made a face. But that was an issue that had been festering for a while. Finally, I was made aware of it and had to step in, mediate that, and address the situation so that we could fix that and continue to move forward. You also see it a lot in turnover. I mean, if you think about it, nobody wants to be in a situation where they feel like they're arguing with each other, they can't cooperate with their employees or their coworkers, they're in conflict. I mean, if you look at it, 49% of employees have left a job due to that conflict that wasn't resolved. On the financial side, so it's not just limited to morale or time, but there actually is a dollar cost associated with conflict. It's estimated that about $385 billion are lost annually in the form of conflict-related disruptions. And at the end of the day, like I touched on, morale tends to take a big hit if there is a high-profile conflict, even if it's not those individuals that are involved. I mean, if there's a big argument that blows up in the middle of a meeting, people are yelling, screaming, swearing at each other, that's going to have a trickle-on effect on anybody who's present in that meeting. And then as people start hearing about that incident, that can have a similar effect that'll trickle on to individuals that weren't even present. So there's also some legal and reputational risks. I mean, if you've been following the news, the whole conflict involving Blake Lively, and I forget the guy's name, so I'm probably going to butcher it, but I think it's Justin Baldoni. That's a pretty high profile situation where they have a disagreement. There's elements of alleged harassment, defamation, things like that. But it's all playing out in the public sphere. So what started as a conflict in the workplace, now it's got legal liability, it's a PR crisis, a whole lot of issues associated with it, all stemming from that single conflict. So it's always a good idea to be mindful of the social media element where anything that is a conflict, it could potentially spiral out and become a lot higher visibility and not just something that you can handle in a closed door meeting to mediate that situation. But if you can jump into it and mitigate it early, you're going to reduce the likelihood of that spiraling out. I've had to navigate through those situations where you get an employee that they weren't happy with the conflict that they were in. They didn't feel like it was being resolved correctly. Next thing you know, Twitter's getting blown up with countless complaints stemming from this employee going out there, making a bunch of remarks about the company, individuals within the company. So it adds that element to it. There's also the safety risk. That's not something people think about or really want to think about. But a lot of the times workplace violence does stem from internal conflicts. Very rarely is it a situation where, out of the blue, somebody snaps. Usually there's some sort of a conflict in there or some sort of grudge that's being held that carries over, it escalates, it's not addressed, and then boom, suddenly you have that big explosion that turns into possible violence. So again, it's always a good idea if you can to try and get in the habit of taking those proactive steps to address it so that you can mitigate those legal risks, mitigate those safety risks, and ultimately mitigate those PR risks as well. So when does conflict cross the line? Like I touched on before, it can be productive, but there are situations where it escalates. So things like workplace violence, like I've touched on before, harassment. So if you have two individuals that may not like each other, it's very easy for that to spiral into kind of bullying behavior, harassing behavior, things like that. If it continues to fester and continues on for a prolonged period, it can even rise to the level of a hostile work environment, which, if that conduct is based on a protected class, can potentially become illegal harassment, which then has that legal implication behind it. Can also turn into discriminatory conduct. So, like I touched on before, a lot of people find conflict uncomfortable. I don't know anybody that actually enjoys conflict, but avoiding it doesn't protect your culture. Ultimately, it's going to erode it. Doing nothing can feel safe, but inaction does have consequences. If it's not addressed, you're going to start out with, okay, you've got those minor conflicts between two individuals. Then it's going to grow. It'll start shifting those team dynamics. It'll start poisoning your morale. Your best employees may decide, hey, I don't want to deal with this, so they'll leave. And then you're going to be left with those toxic individuals that are going to further pollute the culture. You'll start to see that trickle down into further turnover, further talent loss. When I was working in security, I had one account where within a 3-month period, we had over 100% turnover stemming from some conflict between the leadership over there and the team itself. They weren't able to effectively mitigate those conflicts. It kept escalating. Next thing you know, employees are deciding, hey, this isn't worth the money I'm getting paid, so I'm going to go find a different job. And we were cycling through employees like crazy until we were able to really dive in, figure out the root cause of that conflict and address it. And again, like I touched on before, if that conflict isn't addressed and it continues to escalate, it could potentially turn into legal issues down the road. So let's say you do want to take that proactive approach and address that conflict. First and foremost, you want to be mindful of the potential barriers. Some managers, they may not know how to mediate a situation, so they may not have been trained on it. They may not want to escalate the situation by jumping into it, so they choose to ignore it. They may have tried to dive into it and mitigate a situation in the past. Well, if that wasn't successful, that's going to make them less likely to try it again because they've had experience with it. The definition of insanity is trying the same thing and expecting different results. But if they don't know how to alter their plan of attack, they may feel like, hey, I'm just going to have the same situation. They may not know where to start. They may feel like they have real work to do, so it's a low priority for them. They may not want to lose any employees. On the employee side, you'll see things like defensiveness, deflection, and blame shifting. They might withdraw. They might go silent. They may kind of quiet quit, where they're solely going to come in, focus on doing the bare minimum, and refuse to escalate. But before we can overcome that resistance, we really need to learn how to identify those things. So if you see your employees kind of pulling back, you have that one employee that they're the first to post good morning every morning and they're super happy-go-lucky, and then you notice that employee start to pull back, it may be worth taking 5 minutes out of your day to check in with them, see what's going on, see where that shift in behavior came from. It's all about identifying that baseline so you can identify where there's shifts in it, and then that can let you know, hey, there might be something that I need to dig into and address. What are some of the common triggers, though, that can spark tension, spark disagreements, and spark conflict? One of the biggest ones is ambiguous roles and workload. So if you have unclear responsibilities or unclear expectations, it's likely that employees are going to push back on that. If they feel like, hey, I don't understand what you're asking me to do, now you're putting me in a situation where I'm doing the same thing as this other person, but we're approaching it differently. We're trying to accomplish the same goal in different approaches. Hey, now there's an issue. It's going to turn into finger pointing, which is going to escalate things. Communication gaps are another huge one. If there's unclear instructions, there's missing context, updates aren't communicated effectively. If you've got an employee who they're plugging along trying to work on something, and then you come to them 2 days later and say, oh, hey, yeah, we changed that. We don't need you to do any of that work. We're going a different direction. We made that decision a week ago. They're not going to be happy about that. They're going to see it as, hey, I just wasted 2-3 days of my time working on something for no reason. And they may be more likely to have some conflict stemming from that. Cultural and behavioral norms are another big aspect. Certain cultures, they tend to be very blunt and direct with their communication. Other cultures may be more, lack of a better term, flowery with their communication. So somebody who's accustomed to kind of more sugar-coated communication styles, they may kind of chafe against somebody who's very blunt, direct. I've had those situations as well where you have a supervisor, they're prior military, very blunt, very direct, very, hey, this is what needs to get done. And then you have those employees that come in and work under them that they work best around validation, they like the praise side of things, and they don't really function well when they're getting those blunt, direct feedback. So in that situation, we ended up coaching that supervisor on, hey, be mindful of who you're communicating with. Take the time to learn how they respond to communication effectively. And we're able to bridge that gap effectively and move forward. Compensation's another big one. If you have 2 employees and one feels like they're not being paid effectively, meanwhile, the other employee that appears to be doing less work is making a ton of money more, there may be some conflict in there, just stemming from that perceived unfairness. Social tensions can also play up. I mean, right now, political polarization is a huge source of conflict. Hopefully it's not carrying over into the workplace, but if you go anywhere online, I mean, there's constant disagreements with what's going on in the current administration. Social justice movements, things like that. Environmental events and crises, economic uncertainty. There's a lot of factors outside of work that can bleed into the workplace. Doesn't even need to be something big like that. It can be something personal, like if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired outside of work. Well, if you're in a situation where something doesn't necessarily go your way, it's very easy for that to then bleed over into, okay, well, I'm hungry, so I'm going to lash out when I get this feedback. Factors like receiving past negative feedback. So if somebody was very harsh and criticizes somebody in public, that employee that received that feedback previously may struggle to receive criticism in the future. If they feel like they're being treated unfairly or biased against, again, that can bleed over into it. There's a fear of failure, loss of control. So if that employee kind of feels helpless, they may chafe against feedback, things like that. So it's a good idea to be mindful of the fact that you may have a conflict right in front of you, but there's definitely a possibility that other elements outside of work that you may not have control over or may not even have knowledge of could be influencing that conflict as well. So up here, we've got a handy chart that kind of breaks down some of the common differences between generations, which can play into it. Baby boomers, for example, they're more likely to withhold their opinions and defer to hierarchy. Whereas Gen X, they may withdraw, they'll solve it alone, try to avoid any sort of drama. Gen Z, they may just ghost, stay silent, use digital detachment, things like that. And really it boils down to kind of how they were raised and the environment that they grew up in. So baby boomers, there's a lot more focus on top-down workplaces that valued loyalty. Whereas Gen Z, they tend to prefer harmony, fear of cancellation, things of that nature. So how do you bridge that gap? So if you're working with somebody who's maybe a baby boomer, ask them privately for input, show respect for their experience that they bring to the table. If you're working with a millennial, try to normalize healthy tension and emphasize that collaborative element. Gen X, if you can frame that conflict as problem solving, not confrontation, you're going to see a lot more success. So be mindful of who you're communicating with when you're trying to mitigate any sort of conflict in the workplace. So what are some of the warning signs of a conflict escalating beyond just a minor disagreement? Well, you may see increased absenteeism. If employees are in a serious conflict at work, they may not want to be there. So you'll tend to see employees calling in sick more often, or they're arriving late to minimize those interactions. As soon as the meeting ends, they'll be the first one out the door so that they don't have to stick around and deal with that person. You may see decreased communication. If they're in conflict with somebody, they're not going to want to interact with them. So they may spend less time communicating with them or reduce the amount of time they're spent collaborating with them. You may see more office gossip. You may even see the employees start to burn out. If you're in a high stress, high tension environment for a long period of time, it's going to wear on you. And you'll start to see the signs of burnout. Things like that employee pulling back, quiet quitting, things of that nature. So what's HR's role as a mediator? Well, ultimately, HR is there to try and bridge those gaps, restore that trust, and ensure a fair resolution. So they can come in, they can own that process, really dive in, mediate those discussions if it's something that can be done, and really act as that neutral facilitator. Managers, they may be able to mitigate issues between two of their subordinates, but if it's a conflict between an employee and a manager, HR is a great way to bridge that gap where they can come in with a neutral perspective and say, hey, this is our policy. These are our expectations. This is what the company needs from you. This is what your employee needs from you as a manager to be successful. And they can really bridge that gap effectively. They can also act as that coach and advisor. So if a manager is dealing with a conflict and they're not sure where to go, they can reach out to their HR team and say, hey, this is the experience I'm dealing with. This is the impact. This is what I want to do. Do you have any thoughts, any advice, things like that? And they can really try to bridge that gap. They can also be that guard of confidentiality. So sometimes employees may not feel comfortable going to their supervisor with an issue. That could be past experiences, things like that. But HR kind of gives them an off-ramp where they can potentially address that in a confidential manner. Similarly, if the issue is with their supervisor, they may not feel comfortable scaling above their supervisor. So that's kind of where they can reach out to HR, bring them in as kind of that neutral facilitator to address the issue. So as far as conflict management, a lot of the times the solutions tend to fall into a couple different categories. So if it's a competing method, it involves handling that conflict through unilateral decision making. So a lot of the times managers and leaders will use this to kind of weigh both options and go with the one that's going to be what's best for the company. A lot of the times this may not necessarily result in both sides being happy. Typically one will come out as the victor, the other one may feel like the loser in that situation. And that's where good communication is going to be key in helping that individual understand, hey, we didn't go with your decision, but we did listen to it. You made some great points. This is kind of the thought process behind it and clarifying why that decision was made. Collaboration is often ideal. That's where the two sides work together. They gather team input, work together to find a resolution that everybody's happy with. Compromising typically involves both sides kind of trading different aspects of it to where, hey, we may not get exactly what we want, but both sides are getting some sort of a win. The tough thing with compromising is it also typically ends with neither side getting exactly what they want. So there may be some underlying issues stemming from that. But if they can work together to find that compromise, it does help kind of mitigate that conflict somewhat. Accommodating is by allowing the other side to win. That may not be effective. In some situations, it could be useful if it's a minor issue. Hey, whatever, we'll let it go. But you do want to be mindful of circling back with that side that let the other side win to make sure that there's no underlying grudges or resentment stemming from that accommodation. And then avoidance is just ignoring it. If it's something that's happening outside of work or should be resolved through other means, you don't need to get involved in every conflict. If you have two employees, they're in a disagreement over one of them not paying their portion of rent, let them know, hey, keep things at work related. You guys can sort this out on your own time and kind of address it there. In those situations, though, there is always that possibility of things escalating in the workplace. So as far as resolving a conflict, first and foremost, you're going to want to clarify what that disagreement is. Take the time to figure out, okay, what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? From there, you're going to be able to hopefully identify a common goal for both parties. If it's a task-oriented conflict where there's a disagreement on what needs to get done, ultimately they're both working for the same objective of accomplishing the overall goal. They just have different ideas on which task comes first to get it done. So that's where you want to meet with them to discuss that common goal. Say, hey, we all want this marketing plan to succeed. Let's talk through it. You guys have different ideas. Let's figure out what's going to work. If there are barriers to it, identify those, determine what those barriers are, and work through those. It could be, hey, we don't have the budget for your plan, so that's why I proposed Plan B. Okay, well, you don't think Plan B is going to be effective because it's not targeting the market. Okay, well, how can we adjust these plans to better bridge that gap? Once you've gotten a solution in place or a potential solution, try to get both sides to agree on the best way to resolve that conflict, and then acknowledge that solution. And then the last part is key. Determine the responsibilities of each party in that actual resolution. That's where you start assigning accountability, where, hey, we're pushing forward this marketing plan. We had some disagreements, but this is the direction we're going. Mitch, you're going to be in charge of doing A, B, and C. Kyle, you're going to be in charge of doing D, E, and F. Boom. We've established that solution. We've laid out our groundwork. We've established the roles that everybody has. That way we can make sure that everybody's accountable moving forward. So it is important to take note of personality styles as well. Somebody who's an organizer, they're going to want to feel in control, feel secure in their position. They tend to operate better based on rules. So if you establish those rules for the discussion and conduct that discussion in an orderly fashion, they're going to be more receptive to it. Whereas somebody like a helper, they tend to avoid confrontation. They're a good listener. People are important to them, so it's easy for them to forgive and move on. Take the time to really value that relationship, but don't let them hide from conflict. Take the time to treat them gently. Let them know, hey, everything's going to be okay. We're going to work through this. They may prefer to lose or win versus trying to collaborate and find a solution. But take the time, even if they are a good listener, take the time to get their feedback from them. Thinkers, they need to have the facts to feel comfortable. So if you give them the facts, give them time to analyze it, and try not to rush them, they may be able to find the solution all on their own and actually end up agreeing with somebody. So you always want to be mindful of the different personality styles that you're dealing with so that you can effectively utilize their skill set, utilize their personality, and make sure that you're approaching it the right way when navigating with them. So as far as having healthy conversations when there is conflict, you want to explain your point of view to the coworker. And you want to influence your colleague by speaking with them directly. You don't ever want to try and trickle things through the gossip mill or things like that. Have that direct conversation of, hey, I disagree with how we're approaching this. These are my thoughts. You want to avoid making accusatory remarks in those situations. I'm always a big fan of I statements versus you statements. So, hey, I feel like this plan doesn't make sense because of X, Y, and Z. Instead of, you came up with a terrible plan, it's horrible, things like that are accusatory, because instantly you're going to be putting them on the defensive instead of coming to them from a place of, hey, I disagree, here's what I'm going through, here's my thoughts on it. You always want to clarify the issues, so take the time to ask those questions, confirm the answers. When you're dealing with somebody, particularly if they are upset, they may not always make sense. So take the time to repeat it back to them. That gives them the opportunity to address something that may have been misstated or that you may have misheard. And then take the time to explore possible resolutions. Work together with that person to understand their point of view. It should never be a situation where you're coming into it with, hey, it's my way or the highway. They may have valid feedback and may have a way to make the approach even more efficient or more effective. Take the time to listen to them. Validate their feelings. Now, I'm sure we've all been in those conversations where you're talking to them and somebody says something back and you're already plotting on how you're going to respond instead of taking the time to actually listen to what they're saying. You're already preparing your counterpunch or your rebuttal, and you're missing what they're actually saying, and there could be some good information in there. So take the time to listen, engage with what they're saying. And then you always want to try and own your part or apologize for your part in that conflict. That's really how you rebuild that relationship. If you've done something wrong, take ownership of it. But there is an art to apologizing. I'm sure we've all heard those apologies that are something like, I'm sorry your feelings got hurt. I'm sorry you were offended. That's not a very good apology. But if you can take the time to acknowledge the actions, the impact, and take ownership, and ideally include a plan for what's going to be different moving forward, it's going to be received a lot better. So something like, I'm sorry you got your feelings hurt. Saying something like, I'm sorry that I made that comment. I wasn't being mindful of how it would make you feel. I'll be more thoughtful with my future jokes. That's going to sound a lot better because you're taking that ownership. You're acknowledging, hey, I made you feel a certain way. That's my fault. I'm going to be mindful moving forward. You're showing that, hey, you recognize there's an issue, trying to resolve it, and you've got a plan of attack moving forward. Things like, you have every right to be upset. I've damaged your trust. I was insensitive. I put you in a difficult position. Those are always going to sound a lot better than something dismissive like, you're too sensitive is just a joke. We don't know their background. That could have been something that hit on something sensitive for them. So you always want to be mindful of what you're saying, how you're communicating it. And when you're apologizing, take the time to make sure it's an effective apology and show some degree of ownership in it. So as far as de-escalation, when the situation starts kind of spiraling out, turning and yelling, arguing, things are getting heated, you need tools for emotional regulation. Take a step back, ask questions, breathe, listen actively. Because if you're not listening to what they're saying in a heated situation, you're probably not going to be able to catch what the actual problem is. So if you listen actively and empathize with them, while maintaining the respect and professionalism, you're going to be a lot more effective. When you're doing that, you want to focus on behavior, issues, problems that you can fix, not personal attacks. Yes, there are situations where somebody will go on the offensive, and it's unfortunate to hear. If I had $1 for every time I've gotten cussed out by an employee, I'd have a couple dollars. But usually they were coming from a certain place where they were hurt. This problem was causing a lot of issues for them. So if I could step back and say, hey, I understand you're upset. Stop swearing at me. Let's figure out what this issue is and try to move forward from it. That's going to be a lot more effective than, okay, well, now they're throwing personal attacks. So I'm going to turn and start yelling over them. Start swearing at them back, start throwing my own personal jabs, things like that. It's just going to continue to escalate. And the goal here is to de-escalate. Ideally, if you can get everybody to take a step back, sometimes when things are really heated and people are yelling, just say, hey, take a step back. Let's pick up the discussion later on. One of my first investigations, we had an employee that he just kept escalating as we were trying to figure out what the situation was. Finally, we ended up saying, hey, we're not able to have an effective conversation right now. Go home. We'll pick it up tomorrow. We'll revisit that discussion then. In that situation, we could see that the conversation wasn't going to be effective. It wasn't going to resolve the conflict. So we took a step back, gave everybody the chance to kind of cool off, and then revisit it. You also want to suspend judgment. Again, if you're going into a situation with your mind already made up, you're not going to be listening. So pull yourself back, take a second, listen to what's going on, look at the situation in its totality, and then figure out what's going on. Don't be afraid to ask questions. When you're doing that, I always recommend asking open-ended questions. Can you tell me more about that? Is going to be a lot more effective than just asking yes or no questions. If it's open-ended, they're going to be more likely to volunteer your information. You always want to be monitoring nonverbal cues. I mean, hopefully nobody's in a situation where things are potentially escalating into violence, but if you're monitoring body language, you can pick up on cues. Like if somebody's sitting there and their fists are clenched tight, it's a sign that they're potentially very angry and things could escalate. You also want to be mindful of your body language. When I was teaching security officers, one of the biggest things that I'd use as an example was an open-handed gesture is a lot less aggressive than pointing. The camera's probably not going to pick it up very well, but if you're making aggressive pointing, giving somebody directions, if somebody's reviewing that back on a surveillance camera, you could be giving them directions to the restroom, but you could also be making aggressive gestures, things like that, swearing at them, and your gestures are going to convey a certain level of aggression. Whereas if you're kind of making slow, open-handed gestures, like, yeah, you go over there, it's going to be a lot more receptive. And people are going to pick up on that. So if you are in a conflict and you're having that discussion and it's in person, be mindful of your own gestures. If you're rolling your eyes, that's going to escalate things. Spacing's another big one. I mean, if you're in a discussion with somebody and it's getting heated, take a step back. Give yourself some time to react. Avoid blocking a door, for example. If things do get heated and you've got that person backed into a corner, they may feel trapped. So you want to be mindful of things like that. And then one of the best tricks that I've found is acknowledge their feelings, empathize with them, and then convey your intention to help fix the problem. You know, hey, I'm sorry that you have this pay discrepancy. I know it's upsetting for you, but let me work with you. I'm here to help. Instantly, you're building that credibility that you're on their side and trying to work with them instead of going into it, hey, I don't like the way you're talking to me. We're stopping it right now. If you're already shutting them down early on, you're not going to win them over on your side. Finally, if you do have to make a promise of some sort of an outcome or something like that, I recommend avoiding the outcome itself, but promise to take action. Think about it. If I were to be up here and I promised to get Kyle a cookie after this webinar, well, what if the store's closed, bakery shut down, I can't get cookies anywhere? I'm breaking a promise and that conflict's probably going to re-escalate again. But if I say, hey, I'm going to go to the store, I'm going to try and get cookies, do you want them? I'm promising the action, but I'm not promising the outcome because I can't necessarily control that outcome. So we're going to be covering a couple different methods for navigating through it. First up, we've got the SBI method. So that's situation, behavior, and impact. So it slices through the ambiguity by separating the facts from judgments. So have them describe the situation, then describe the behavior, and discuss the impact. So where did the incident occur? When did it occur? Give me the context behind what took place. From there, okay, what took place? Was the person swearing? Was the person yelling? Did they raise their voice? Try to figure out what specific took place. If it's, oh yeah, they were making inappropriate remarks. Okay, well, what were those remarks? If they were swearing, what swear words were specifically said? The more specific you can be with trying to gather information on what the behavior was, the easier it's going to be to address outcomes and figure out a game plan moving forward. You also want to discuss the impact. So if somebody has an outburst in a meeting stemming from a conflict, what's the impact on the team? How does that impact the outcomes for everyone as a whole? What's the impact on the relationship? Really try to drill in and figure out what exactly is going on, because the more details you can get, the better. Now over here, we've got the Lara method. So the listen, affirm, respond, and add approach. And this is a great way to navigate through those tense situations. Maybe it's emotionally charged. where you're discussing the sensitive topics, misunderstandings, the tension, and trying to figure out what is going on and how it can be addressed. First up, you want to listen. Try to listen to understand and find something on which you can get both parties to agree. From there, you provide affirmations. Show, hey, I understand where this could be difficult. I understand where this can complicate things. When you respond, be respectful. It's probably the biggest one that I've seen a lot of people slip up on, especially in heated situations where they get disrespected, so then they respond with disrespect, and then it continues to spiral out. But if you can maintain that civil discourse, it's going to be a lot smoother. Another de-escalation trick that I just remembered, if you have somebody who's yelling, you can actually drop the volume of your own voice. And because you're going to be a little bit quieter, they're going to realize how much louder their voice is, and you can actually get somebody to drop their volume that way. Because they'll realize, hey, I'm being super loud. I need to tone it down. And then from there, add information. Show you want to continue that conversation. Really, it's all about taking the time to understand what's going on, identify the parts that you can make that connection with, build that rapport, continue to respond respectfully, and then continue that discussion from there. Keep adding information, adding your point of view, and really navigating through it from there. So not every situation can be handled in-house, though. Some conflicts may just exceed the internal capacity, whether that's you don't have somebody with the training or bandwidth to jump in and mediate, or it's become so complex that it's beyond the scope of what anybody in-house can handle. That's where you start to lean on people like professional mediators. Employee assistance programs do have resources as well. You may want to reach out to your legal counsel or even specialty consultants. Things like a single off-color comment, you might be able to address that in-house. Hey, they had a disagreement. This employee made an inappropriate joke. Sit both employees down, say, hey, inappropriate jokes are inappropriate, and mitigate it there, and the conflict will be smoothed out. But if it's something where you have two highly charged employees that are lobbing serious counter complaints at each other, it's escalating out, the managers tried to mediate, wasn't successful, and it's turning into a high stakes HR investigation, possibly litigation, that's when it's beneficial to bring in that third party to either investigate, mediate, prepare for the legal, regulatory implications, things of that nature. Or if it's an emotional safety concern. I've had employees who were going through some mental health situations, and it was trickling over into the workplace where they were starting to get into a lot of conflicts. Yes, my background is in psychology, but I'm definitely not trained to navigate through that effectively. And that's where you start leaning on, hey, we've got an EAP program. They can connect with resources that might be helpful, things like that, and work with them from that standpoint where you can tag in those resources, tag in those that might be a better fit for helping out that employee in that situation. So ultimately, you want to develop a culture of conflict literacy. First and foremost, you want to have policies and training on conflict resolution. The better trained your staff is on how to navigate through those situations, how to recognize conflict and mitigate it early, the more effective you're going to be. Try to encourage open communication and create a supportive and respectful work environment where even if there is a disagreement, it can be handled in a healthy manner. If you're the type of company where leadership comes in, yells at everybody, and then leaves, it's not really going to foster that respectful work environment. Employees are going to see that, and then they're going to carry that on into their day-to-day. But if you have a situation where higher ups can see, hey, we had a disagreement, we talked through it, this is the outcome, employees are going to see that, and they're going to start to replicate that as well. So try to model that emotional intelligence. Try to normalize healthy disagreements where, hey, if there's a conflict, we can talk it out. We can work through it. And then take the time to praise that resolution. If you can condition employees to feel happy or be proud of the fact that they worked through that situation at a low level, they're going to be more likely to do it. So, in conclusion, disagreements between employees, and whether it's between employees or between employees and management, a lot of the times it's going to come down to differing work styles, communication breakdowns, or even personal issues that spill over into the professional setting. The more effective you can be at mitigating those issues early on, the better everyone's going to be in the long run, because it's not going to spiral out and escalate into those situations that you hear about on the news of things like workplace violence or what have you. That said, many organizations do struggle to address and resolve those conflicts simply because they don't take the time to either develop the skill set necessary to address it, or they try to avoid it. You know, the best teams out there, they don't avoid conflict. They navigate through it together. They recognize, hey, we have a disagreement. Let's work through this, find a way that we can all move forward together, instead of it's my way or the highway, shuffling people out, hitting that high turnover just because they want to be right. That said, employers must recognize the importance of addressing conflict head on. You know, if there's one takeaway you get from the last 50 minutes or so that I've been speaking, it's the sooner you can address those conflicts and take the proactive steps to resolve them, the better. If you let it fester, it's just going to continue to grow, and that's where you tend to see the long-term harm. You know, any of the workplace violence investigations I've had didn't start out with the flip of the switch. It was typically something that had been festering for a while. Employee was collecting grievances, and then finally it trickled up to a point where, oh no, now we need to intervene and address this before it turns into an actual workplace violence situation. So take the time, address it early, recognize that it can be productive, and you'll be set to move forward. So with that, I got a couple minutes left, so I do want to open things up for questions. Again, I really appreciate you letting me present. My contact information's up here. You can also reach out to hr@ironwoodbc.com and get in touch with us. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions if anybody has any.
I don't see any questions in the chat right now. But if anyone has any, feel free to unmute yourselves and share. That was a lot of great information. Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, I especially like seeing the Lara method, being able to see those steps of like, okay, what do you do now? I do not like conflict. So it was nice to say, okay, have a plan. Here's how we're going to handle it. That was really interesting to me. So.
And I liked the generational stuff, how different generations tend to communicate. That was super helpful.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
And excuse the hair. I was walking and listening at the same time. Don't want my hair to get messed up. But my question is not necessarily about how to resolve conflict, but do you have any suggestions on like red flags or warning signs when hiring or in the first stages of a new employee to look for that could potentially a toxic employee that would cause more conflict?
Well, it depends. I mean, I've seen some employees that they come in, on paper, they're a rock star, they interviewed really well. And then once they get in, then all the red flags start showing. On the flip side, I've also seen those employees where in the interview, you're kind of looking at it as, okay, well, they might be a little bit more confrontational, pushing back on things, but they're doing it from a good place where they genuinely want to see the company succeed. So it does ultimately come down to kind of the personality and being able to read that. One of the best questions I can think of on the interview would be ask them to describe a time where they've navigated through a workplace conflict. You want to make sure that you're asking it open-ended. and giving them the opportunity to provide you with an example. From there, you can look at how they approached it. If it's something where they're coming back and saying, "Oh no, I've never been in a conflict at work," well, they're either being dishonest or they're avoidant. If they give you an example where it was, "Yeah, no, I cussed them out and everything worked out," that's probably a red flag. So it's kind of asking those questions where they're going to give you a situation and an example, and then looking at how they approached it from there to get a better understanding of how they navigate through it.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Tip if you'd like. I've also asked, what's your pet peeve in the interviews? What's your workplace pet peeve? It can be very, very telling. And it can tell you a lot, I guess, and really how they navigate, how to talk about things that might not be completely pleasant to them in a proper way. And also if it's, there's a lot of red flags there. If it's a lighthearted one, usually a good sign. If they dig deep immediately in the interview, that's how I think, okay, I appreciate honesty, but.
Yep. Another good one is if you are asking kind of those scenario-based questions, you can tailor it around the role. So if I was looking at conflict in the workplace, instead of just saying, "Okay, well, walk me through a time you had a disagreement with a coworker," I could say, "How would you approach a situation where you've provided a client guidance on a regulatory issue and the client is refusing to listen to the feedback you're providing them?" So you're creating a scenario for them, and then they're going to show you how they navigate through that. And you're ultimately tailoring it to the potential conflicts in the workplace.
I have another question. What about addressing when when employees, I guess, cross boundaries with customers or clients, and you have to address it to teach them what the boundaries are, even though they've already been expressed. And then there's awkwardness afterwards because you just have an awkward. I think that's where I've had to have such awkward conversations with people or with employees because of the way that they handle certain situations. And even though I feel like I've addressed it in a really professional and empathetic way, then there's just such awkwardness. And I know you touched on this, but it's still so hard to address because there's always that awkwardness there.
No, and it's understandable. I mean, in those situations, you want to be able to lean back on your policies and your expectations first and foremost to kind of say, "Hey, this is what we need you to be doing. It's A, B, and C. Maybe don't be texting clients on your personal phone, inviting them out to dinner," things like that. And then, so you've set those expectations. It's kind of natural for the employee to be a little bit gun shy afterwards because they got counsel.
Right.
And that's where engaging in those discussions that aren't negative to kind of rebuild that rapport with the employee is going to be key. It doesn't need to be, "Okay, I wrote you up. Now we're going to be best friends, socializing all the time," but just checking in with them saying, "Hey, doing okay?" Things like that. And framing it so that it's not just them coming to you in a negative light. I saw that a lot when I was doing in-house employee relations. I had a reputation as a grim reaper because anytime they get sent to talk to me, I was HR, I was the one handling terminations, things like that. So I'd show up at a client site and employees were instinctively kind of on guard and guarded. And that's where I'd take the time to have those positive discussions and say, "Hey, is there something I can help you with? Is everything going good?" Checking in with them to build that rapport back. took some time, but ultimately I was able to build those relationships and kind of counteract that reputation.
Okay, thank you.
So Mitch, I just want to thank you for today's Power Hour. As I mentioned, the slides will be emailed to everyone who is here and will be available for replay, and the session was recorded. So we're going to put it in the member resource center of your member login area as well. If you need any help logging in, you can just send an email to us here at the chamber and we can help you with that. The next Power Hour will be on Tuesday, June 3rd at 10 a.m. via Zoom. It's called Emergency Planning for Your Business and will be presented by Jason Bonney, Assistant Chief for the Central Jackson County Fire Protection District. And I think that is all that we have for today. So again, thank you for attending, and we hope you guys have a great day.